my name is Allison Gearhart, and this is my Share My Findings. When I first started looking into this subject, I had the original research question of what are strategies used by interpreters to navigate emotional triggers. As I got more into the topic, I found that there wasn't a lot of research as far as strategies used, but more how interpreters are affected mentally by this trauma. And so I changed my current research question. The reason that I am looking into this topic is because although I am looking to go into mental health interpreting way down the road, I know that this is a topic and a subject that can affect any interpreter in any type of interpreting work as well. And it's not something that is necessarily that I know of involved in our education, but it is a wealth of knowledge that we all should have. So let's check it out. My RSA number 1 is secondary traumatic stress effects on the professional life of the sign language interpreters. Below you can see the authors and the year that it was published as well as the journal it was published in. The summary of this is that they were looking at the professional quality of life that these interpreters had in regards to secondary traumatic stress that they experienced. They also looked at STS in relation to burnout, STS in relation to compassion fatigue, and then STS and burnout in the relation to the years of practicing, as well as they looked at that in newer interpreters. So they wanted to see the difference between the experienced, more veteran interpreters and compares with newer interpreters. So the technicalities behind this research is that there was 85 participants, Canada and US based, all had to be licensed with someone. The questionnaire that they sent out was quantitative in nature, the data that they were collecting, although the types of questions they were asking, in my opinion, were qualitative in nature because they were dealing with the emotions and the thoughts of these interpreters. The results of this were that interpreters tend to show STS in higher quantities that is acceptable by mental health professionals. It also showed that the younger interpreters rate higher in all 3 categories. So younger interpreters experience more burnout, more stress due to the job, as well as personal satisfaction. It was interesting that the older interpreters, the longer they had been in the field, the lower they rated on the STS and burnout, but they maintained that professional satisfaction. So we just need to get there eventually. My second RSA is the association between job burnout and self-efficacy, a meta-analysis. Below you can see the authors, the year published, as well as the journal. The summary of this was that it investigates the relationship between job burnout and self-efficacy. It also looked at the occupation of the participants, as well as the number of years in the field and the age of the participants. Now, this particular study was very interesting in the fact that it did no original and self-research. What they did, however, was they pulled data from 57 different studies worldwide that were associated with job burnout, self-efficacy, and a different kind of occupation. So, essentially, 22,774 individuals from various professionals, backgrounds, ages, cultures, locations in the world, everything like that, were participants in this study via another study. What they did was they gathered anything that was quantitative in nature and chucked everything that was qualitative, and they organized, sifted, and collected as much data that pertained to what they were researching. The results were that there was an average effect of self-efficacy in relation to depersonalization and emotional exhaustion. So in that sense, self-efficacy and those symptoms are pretty much null. Like, they don't really associate with each other. However, the age and time in the field meant that more self-efficacy the individuals had and less burnout. Now, as I said, a downfall of this was that there was not any first-hand data, even though a wealth of knowledge was gathered from all these different studies. My third RSA is secondary trauma self-efficacy, concept and its measurement. I apologize. And below there are the authors, the journal, and the date published. The summary of this is that it examines the benefits of self-efficacy in regards to secondary trauma exposure. Now, this study was also really interesting in the fact that there wasn't any previous research in regards to secondary trauma and self-efficacy, whereas there was a lot on direct trauma and PTSD. So what this research, what they attempted to do was test the applicability of a newly developed scale called the Secondary Trauma and Self-Efficacy Scale, STSE, to avoid that mouthful in the future. They used this new scale to test the relationship between secondary trauma and self-efficacy, and it was hypothesized that they had a moderate to strong association. They also tested the correlation between STSE and other secondary trauma-related cognition, such as an individual's perception of the world, whether they viewed traumatic events as a growth opportunity or not, and what their own perceived self and world image was. The technicalities of this is that 247 mental health providers working with U.S. soldiers for at least a year and had indicated that they had been indirectly exposed to trauma were the subject pools. The reason that they did such a narrow requirements for the study was because they wanted to test the scale on people that they knew they had what they were measuring. So they used a Likert type scale, and the survey was emailed to these participants. It inquired on traumatic frequency, the type of trauma, if that was relevant, the frequency of symptoms, and how often they had to manage with those, and this all related to the STSE scale. The results of this were that the STSE scale explained up to 39% of secondary traumatic stress. Now, this is really interesting because previous studies hadn't pinpointed secondary traumatic stress as a stressor in the people that they had studied, whereas this one was able to indicate that secondary traumatic stress was the resulted in 39%. It also showed that the STSE scale showed participants affected significantly to moderately. This also indicated that the more self-efficacy an individual had, the less chance of secondary trauma. Now, this is really important. For those of you that didn't research self-efficacy a million times when they were doing this paper, it essentially means if you have the belief that you have the tools and the ability to manage and go through a situation, the better chances you have of actually accomplishing that. And so this is really interesting because the self-efficacy is believing that you can go through the trauma, but this indicates that the more of that you have, the less you're affected by the trauma in general. Now, this also was supported by the fact that the more support and positive perspective the individual had, not even in regards to self-efficacy, but with any type of positive mindset, whether that was their own, whether that was the world, whether that was them perceiving that they had support, resulted in being less affected by trauma. My fourth RSA is Sign Language Interpreters and Burnout, the effects of perfectionism, perceiving stress, and coping. Below you can see the researchers, the year published, as well as the journal that it was in. The summary of this is that it examines the effects of adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism in their relation to burnout. Now, this was really interesting to me because it separates the two. It's not just looking at perfectionism, it's looking at adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. It also looked at the perceived stress in relation to maladaptive perfectionism and burnout, also coping resources and how that moderates the relationship between maladaptive perfectionism and burnout. The technicalities behind this is that there were 238 participants. Now, these came from an RID conference, but this was also sent out via social media. It was a quantitative questionnaire using Likert scale and also using the almost perfect scale and perceived stress scale to organize and create those questions. The results of this were that maladaptive perfection correlated to burnout. Now, this was already indicated to previous studies, so that isn't a huge surprise. But what was interesting is that maladaptive perfectionism is associated with perceived stress resulting in burnout. And what it showed is the maladaptive perfectionism and those other two things pretty much snowball over and over again. So if you have an instance where maladaptive perfectionism is triggered, then it creates perceived stress, and that results to burnout. And this just happens over and over again until that cycle's broken. Has also surprisingly showed that there was no correlation between adaptive perfectionism and burnout. So we can be perfectionists, but we have to be perfectionists about how we're perfectionists. And then it also showed coping strategies did help combat burnout in general, no matter what those coping strategies were for the interpreter. My RSA number 5 is coping with vicarious trauma and mental health interpreting. Below you have the author, the year published, as well as the journal it was published in, and this is the one that really tied it all together with me, which is why I decided to do it last. The summary of this examines ASL interpreters' coping mechanisms when working with mental health. So what they did was they took strictly mental health interpreters and looked at their self-care tactics utilized to cope with implications of secondary or vicarious trauma. Now, the goal of this study was to provide a baseline of data for future interpreters' benefits with the hope that future training programs would incorporate this first-hand knowledge into the training of future interpreters. This was with the hope that the future interpreters may possess coping strategies against secondary and vicarious trauma and the subsequent repercussions. It was also important to note that there was no designated research question or hypothesis with this particular study. They were just looking to gather wisdom from these interpreters. So the research of this is that they sent this questionnaire out via email. There was 222 applicable, meaning that they worked in mental health previously and were licensed interpreters that participated. They looked at quantitative and qualitative information for the study and gathered it via a 41-question open-ended and closed-ended questionnaire or survey, and the results were that an astonishing 83% of interpreters experience vicarious trauma from mental health assignments. Now, it's important to note that out of these 83% of interpreters were affected, they were only affected by about 25% of their assignments. So they could go into some mental health assignments and not have any repercussions, but 25% of them did have implications further down the road of that secondary traumatic stress. 80% of these interpreters indicated debriefing with colleagues as the preferred coping mechanism, although it is important to note that almost all of these interpreters were conflicted with this coping mechanism due to the fact that they were concerned with the level of confidentiality that we are all held to as interpreters. It is also really important to note that this research showed that 58% of interpreters indicated that they had no previous training on how to manage mental health demands and emotional strain. Why this is so important is that any type of healthcare provider, whether it's mental health or not, has prior training to self-manage and self-care in regards to the secondary trauma and stress that they can come in contact with. The fact that we are sitting in that same room that they are and don't have that training was astonishing to me. So what all of the research can agree on is that interpreters all show high levels of secondary trauma and stress. It is something that is just common in our field, unfortunately. It also showed that self-efficacy is an important tool in interpreters' mental health care box, just to make sure that we have that ability to manage the situation in the first place was really beneficial to secondary repercussions. If anything was concerning to me, is that there is little, if any, training required or taught to manage this common result of our occupation and of interpreting. The one thing that I found to be encouraging is that, just like the last study that we looked at, research is underway to help future generations of interpreters. So we realize that there is a problem, and now we're looking at how to fix that issue. In a nutshell, what I've learned from this research so far is that interpreters need coping strategy training. Period, exclamation mark. How I am going to work on my final RSA for my research paper is I have a plethora of articles that I have saved that are in regards to what I went over today. Went over how interpreters are affected mentally with this trauma. However, not a whole lot of those articles, if any, have any solutions in them, which I find to be disappointed because that's kind of what I'm after, is looking for ways that we can benefit and help this problem. One thing that I will probably look into is mental health providers and healthcare providers in general and what secondary trauma coping strategies they have in place. And I'll probably go from there. If you have any questions, I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. Thank you very much.